The main challenges that we find when we're capturing nebulae in the sky is overcoming light pollution, getting enough data, tracking accurately so that you can take long exposures, coping with the seeing conditions, managing noise in your images, how to increase the signal to noise ratio in your images, the question of using expensive equipment, and the whole business of processing, which is basically stacking the images together and then editing them. These are all the main challenges that we need to overcome if we're going to capture gorgeous nebulae, like I have done many times. Okay, let's go over some of the more advanced and intermediate techniques that we need to focus on. In this video, we'll focus on image acquisition, because you need to get decent information to start with. Once you've got that, the rest becomes much easier. So first of all, there are a few things that you can do to manage light pollution. The best option, of course, is to try and visit the darkest sky you can find and go image there. But if that's not possible, you can try using narrowband filters. This is something I often do. It cuts out light pollution and also enables you to image during full moons. There are also light pollution filters for RGB targets that will help as well. When you're trying to capture nebulae, it's a good idea to pick those that will be in the darkest part of your sky. Remember that your sky is not one level. It does vary. Towards the north, I have a much darker patch. What I try to do is I try to image in the darker areas of my sky, avoiding the low horizon, because higher up in the sky is much less affected by light pollution, and you'll get much better results. When I first began photographing nebulae, I was happy to capture only about 3 or 4 hours of data and then go and process it into what I thought was a half decent image. Now, though, after a few years of experience, I usually aim for at least 10 to 15 hours of total exposure time. Of course, how much you want to spend on a target is totally up to you and what you expect to get as a final result. One problem you may have is getting enough time under clear skies to capture your target nebula and get enough data. I am lucky in that respect because I usually image in Turkey, where skies are normally very clear for nights on end. However, if you live in a more cloudy area, as many of you probably do, be persistent and don't be tempted, as I have in the past, to move on to a new target after a few hours and make do with that, process your image. You'll find that you end up with something a bit mediocre. So it's well worth spending as long as you possibly can to image and get the exposure you need to get those fine details and beautiful colors which you're looking for, even if it takes a week or more to get enough data to do justice to the target you've chosen. Don't forget as well that the darker your skies, the less data you'll need to get a quality image. The third challenge you'll face when trying to photograph nebulae is tracking accurately so you can take long exposures. Some nebulae are very bright, such as the Orion Nebula, but many are very faint and far away. So we need to take longer exposures of up to many minutes to be able to capture the finer details of those gases and clouds of dust that will make our images look absolutely amazing. This means we'll need to track the stars accurately and ensure that you don't have star trails or blurry images. I use an equatorial mount that must be accurately polar aligned and set up to work correctly. See the links down below in the description for more information about this on my website astroimagery.com and previous videos I've made about polar aligning your mount accurately and how to use an equatorial mount. I also recommend using an auto-guiding setup to make it possible to get good quality, longer exposures, improving the quality of your nebula images. Auto guiding will improve the accuracy of the tracking because mounts have errors in their tracking motors and gears, which can spoil your images completely. I normally aim for between 3 and 6 minutes exposure for most nebulae out there, but for the really faint ones, 10 minutes or more may actually be necessary.
Let's talk now about seeing conditions. Although the sky may look clear, the atmosphere experiences distortion, and this can affect our images in astrophotography in several ways. I sometimes get bad auto gliding and can see the star I am locked onto changing in brightness on my laptop screen. P2 is the software I use for guiding, and this also gives a value for the signal to noise ratio of my guide star, and this value can change with poor seeing. The problem with seeing conditions is that it can cause details to be lost, and your nebula frames will not be as clear as they might be on other nights. To improve seeing conditions, we really need to get high above the atmospheric disturbance, for example, into the mountains. That's why so many observatories are situated there. This, however, is really not practical for most of us backyard astrophotographers. So what can we do? We can use an astronomy forecast, and if seeing is that bad, it's best to just wait until conditions are better. There's not much else that we can really do. One way that you can see the effects of atmospheric distortion is to notice how stars twinkle in the night sky. More twinkling means more atmospheric disturbance. If you were out in space beyond the Earth's atmosphere, you'd notice no twinkling when you look
Every
at the
image that we take in astrophotography with a digital camera, be it a DSLR or an astro camera, suffers from noise. We can see in a few images that I have for you here just how much difference noise does make. Noise obscures details and lowers signal to noise ratio, which is why it's very important to remove. Now, any kind of electronic device, such as a camera, will create noise. One thing you should try, though, is to cool your camera. I switched from a DSLR to an astro camera, which is cooled, and I always cool my camera down to 0 degrees. It could even go lower. The difference is that by lowering the temperature of your sensor, you lower noise exponentially. And that can only be good for both signal to noise ratio and the noise level of your photo. Let's now talk about equipment. Let's go a little bit beyond the basics and discuss specialized equipment choices for astrophotography. First of all, high-end telescopes. What are the benefits of apochromatic refractors, or APOs, or Ritchey-Chrétien telescopes for imaging nebulas? Let's talk about apochromatic refractors, APOs. APOs are highly regarded for astrophotography, especially for photographing nebulae. And the reason is simple, that unlike standard achromatic refractors, which suffer from chromatic aberration or color fringing, APOs use special glass, for example, low dispersion glass, to minimize this problem. This results in much sharper images with better colors and better contrast, crucial for capturing the fine details and hues of nebulae. These telescopes can cost many thousands of dollars, but are worth it if you have the budget. Ritchey-Chrétien telescopes are a type of reflector telescope with great optics, particularly suitable for astrophotography. They use a combination of hyperbolic mirrors to eliminate coma. What is coma? This is an aberration that makes stars appear elongated, especially towards the edges of the field. And I noticed that quite a bit in my telescope. The result is a flat field of view with pinpoint stars, ideal for capturing large nebulae. Let's talk now a little bit about focal length, because that's an important characteristic of high-end telescopes. The focal length determines the image scale and the field of view. For a shorter focal length, for example, between 400 and 600 millimeters, we'll have a wide field of view, and this would be suitable for capturing large nebulae or multiple nebulae in one frame. Appos often fall into this range. If you'd like a longer focal length, for example 1000 millimeters and above, then you'll get a narrower field of view and you'll be able to zoom in on smaller nebulae and resolve finer details within larger nebulae. Ritchie-Chrétiens often have much longer focal lengths. The choice of telescope depends on the size of the nebula you want to image and the desired level of detail you want to get. So do bear this in mind if thinking about spending a little bit more money. The aperture. The aperture is the diameter of the telescope's main lens or mirror, and this determines its light gathering ability. The larger the aperture, the more light the telescope collects, allowing for shorter exposure times and better, fainter details in your nebulae. A smaller aperture means longer exposure times to gather the same amount of light. While a larger aperture is generally better, it also increases the cost of the telescope and its weight. Appos tend to have smaller apertures than Ritchie-Chrétiens for the same price. Although I'd like to have a bigger budget, I actually use a reflector telescope, which is quite cheap by comparison to some of these high-end telescopes. But there is no doubt to me that higher quality telescopes will collect light faster and produce much better images of nebulae. Next, we'll talk about dedicated astrophotography cameras. I actually recently spent about £1,000 on as well astro camera, and I'm so glad I did switch to a CMOS or CCD camera. The most important difference is that it's producing images of a much higher quality, a better resolution, noise is reduced, and also I have a cooling facility. Here's a quick summary and a few more tips that will improve your images of nebulae. We've mentioned so far that you can 1. Use filters and choose targets so as to minimize the effects of light pollution. 2. You need to get more imaging data. Number 3, take longer exposures. Number 4, in order to do this, improve your tracking. 5, use a high quality telescope. 6, cool your camera to reduce noise. And finally, here are a few more tips. Buy the best equatorial mount you can. It will make a huge difference to your tracking and image quality. Use accessories like dew heaters to minimize condensation in your telescope optics. You can also use a coma corrector or field flattener to improve any aberration in your images. If you use a reflector telescope, check the collimation regularly, an easy job which requires you to adjust the mirrors to make your images sharper. It usually doesn't take me more than about 5 minutes to do this. And lastly, work on your post-processing skills, as this is more than half the job. You may have great data, but poor editing skills can absolutely ruin your images. That's all for now. Please take a moment to help me out by liking this video and do subscribe for more. See you in the next video.